Hello and welcome back to the EMJ GOLD podcast, brought to you by EMJ, your #1 open access destination for HCPs and pharma globally. Season 8, episode 2.
Nice.
It's great to be here with you. How are you doing?
Thank you. Doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a really exciting week on GOLD. We've actually just launched a new infographic.
Yes, I know you personally have been learning a lot about interactive content, and that is exactly what this new piece is all about.
Yeah, it's packed with loads of really interesting insights. So if interactive content is something you want to learn more about, we've got a real world case study in there. We've got information about how it boosts retention and, loads of other things. So do check it out after this episode.
I couldn't agree more. So if you are interested, we'll include a link to the infographic in the show notes for you. But getting back to today, very excited for this episode. What have we got in store?
Well, today we're going to be sharing an interview that Jade actually conducted with a really interesting guy, John Bernard Simeon, or JB as he's more commonly known, and he is the SVP and head of ViiV Healthcare Europe. When did JB join ViiV, Jade?
Well, back in January 2022, he left GSK for ViiV, and he's leading the European business there, and he looks over 9 of ViiV's markets. Wow. So yeah, he works really closely with GSK too.
That's right. JB actually started his career at GSK, and during his time as general manager, really drove a culture of fundamental change in the business and helped them establish a really strong performance in vaccines and specialty care. These days, however, he is obviously very well known for his work at ViiV, which is known for its activities in the HIV space, and that will be the crux of the conversation today.
Absolutely. It was a really interesting conversation, as I said, and we're going to be hearing some of JB's thoughts on the UNAIDS roadmap to end the HIV epidemic by 2030, the barriers that are faced by people living with HIV, especially in the Europe space, and then just so much more. I can't really remember everything we talked about. It was so good. But yeah, enough from me, I think. Let's get into the episode.
Let's do it.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
My
I'm
pleasure.
really excited to be talking to you, JB. So the first thing I sort of want to get into, if it were, is your career. You've spent quite an impressive 30 years almost in the pharmaceutical industry, but I know that's not specifically what you studied first of all, and that you entered the field in more of a sales capacity. First of all, what inspired the change there? And then do you think you've taken any lessons from your time in the sort of sales sphere that you can use in your day-to-day at your current role?
Well, obviously you build a lot of experience across your career, but I think I ended up in the pharma industry not by chance, because actually I come from a family of doctors of 5 generations. So somehow healthcare and pharma has been part of my life since I was a child. So I started indeed as a business school, because unlike my ancestors, I wanted to see the world, and that's how I decided to take that avenue. And indeed I started in sales, maybe a bit randomly. As you get out of university, you want to explore. But quite quickly indeed I joined at the time SmithKline Beecham, later became GSK, as I was really attracted by the impact it had and the purpose of the organization. And since then, I've been many, many years in infectious diseases. So I've really seen the impact we can have on public health. I've also learned, and we all have learned through the COVID experience, that to have impact in infectious disease, we have to have a global approach. And of course, having traveled around the world, see many different healthcare systems, development level of the different populations, how people access care, the challenges they face with infectious diseases, I realized it was very important to have this global approach. But at the same time, coming from a family of doctors, I've also heard a lot through the family conversations, stories about patients, the impact on their lives, of the diseases, not just their life, but the families, the people who they love. And I realized that if you want to really have an impact in health, you always have to oscillate between the bigger picture, the global public health, but also the individual impact. And whether it was for vaccines, where I started my career, where I am today in the field of HIV, I've always carried that with me.
I think that's a really great approach to take as well. I think you can sort of get lost in the reeds of having the global approach, and then it's really important to remember at the end of the day, everything is going back to patients.
Absolutely. And how they live, the perception about the disease, how they get access to care, how they live with it is so different across the world, and even within our countries. I mean, depending on the communities where you belong, people will approach the situation very differently, and you need to really have this customized approach as well as not losing sight of the bigger picture.
You touched on your current role now, and you're focused much more on the HIV space.
Correct.
I wanted to chat to you about the current state of HIV in 2024 as we are now, and I know you're quite interested in the UNAIDS roadmap to end HIV. Could you tell the audience a bit
about that and what those goals are?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we need to recognize we've done a tremendous job collectively in the field of HIV. When the epidemic started more than 40 years ago, I mean, it was almost a death sentence, and people were desperate for any progress we could make to help these people suffering and living with the virus. And we have developed over the years fantastic medicines, and we've come to a point now where we have very effective medicines, very safe medicines. People take one tablet a day, and actually they can live almost a normal life, and certainly as long as everybody else in the population. However, we think the job is not done. And it's not done because we still have nowadays 40 million of people living with HIV. It is actually a combination of the fact that people live longer with HIV, but also, unfortunately, we still have a lot of people acquiring the infection, with 1.3 million acquiring the virus in 2023. So UNAIDS has set a goal which we think is very inspirational and aspirational, which is to end the epidemic by 2030. And getting there with a goal of the 95, 95, 95. So 95% of people detected, 95% of people being treated, and 95% of people being suppressed. So it means that the virus getting to a level that is undetectable, which of course therefore allows them to live a normal life, but also stops transmission. So we've made great progress, different in different regions of the world, of course, but we're not there yet. Today we estimate that about 9 million people escape the goals of the programs across the world, and even in more developed countries like Europe or the US, we are not at this 95. So there's still a lot of work to be done to control the spread of the virus, to control the consequences of people living with HIV, but also to address the perception of that disease. There's a lot of stigmas associated with it, sometimes a lot of self-stigmas, people feeling guilty, and psychological burden is very important. Maybe we can talk about that as well.
Definitely, I think so.
We have a holistic approach, and we treat the person, not the virus. And certainly GSK and ViiV, and we work together, has a very strong prevention agenda. And we see prevention in two ways. First, to have fantastic PrEP solutions, but we say we have some challenges with that, is to identify the people who would benefit. But we also see treatment as PrEP, because if people take the treatment excellently, they suppress the virus, they don't transmit. So HR is preventing transmission of virus to others, and therefore is protecting the rest of the population. So treatment and prevention really help the prevention agenda, which we know is the best way to use taxpayer money. Prevention is better than cure. It keeps the population healthy, and often is the return on that investment is often superior. So we are really engaged in that logic. This is what we see is happening across the world. Certainly, COVID has helped people realize that prevention strategies are so important to keep the public health at an excellent stage, to keep the problems at bay. So, absolutely engaged in that journey.
Are there any specific challenges that we're facing in Europe specifically at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, Europe has done pretty well, to be honest. I mean, some countries are very, very close to the 95, but unfortunately we had, I think, about 20,000 new infections 2 years ago still. So it means that the number of people living with HIV still augments. We are facing new challenges. I mean, the face of the epidemic is changing quite a lot in terms of the communities that are a bit more affected nowadays than maybe in the past. Typically, these communities are the men having sex with men, the sex workers, people who are taking drugs, and more we have migrants as well. We know that we have a big migrant crisis in Europe at the moment, and often these people are very vulnerable. They often contract the infection when they get to Europe, sadly. But also what we see in Europe is that other populations as well, other communities as well, start to be infected, and some people don't know how they acquire the infection. So even in the European context, it's not under control.
Right. I think this is something, I know the BBC released an episode of a documentary earlier this year as well. It was called HIV Prep and Me, and they were discussing in there, they spoke to 3 people that do have HIV, and one of them was just a woman having sex with men, and she just said, yeah, I never expected this would happen to me, but now this life-saving drug has become available to me, and it's such a shame that she didn't know about it beforehand. So yeah, it's quite it's amazing the things that drugs can do to really help people live longer and, you know, almost normal lives once they do contract HIV.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you have a number of challenges for people who are living with the virus, and other challenges for people who are not living with the virus but don't necessarily know they're at risk. So when you are living with the virus nowadays, we see that, yes, clinically patients can be absolutely fine, but they have a lot of psychological burden themselves, and they, for a number of reasons. One is the self-stigma. I mean, they have this daily reminder every time they take a pill that what happened to them and that they're living with HIV. Some actually are really scared to disclose the situation, and we know from studies that about 1 in 4 people have not even told their family members that they are living with the virus. So it is actually very, very hard. They have to hide their medicine. They don't want their friends to know. Sometimes their sister, their brother doesn't know. And also sometimes people forget. And you know that if you forget, there is a risk the virus might rebound, which of course puts you at risk. These are reasons why we still have challenges in Europe. Other challenge is access to care. Not everybody has an insurance, it's a health insurance. In some places, it's not so easy to access HIV centers. We spoke about migrants. Many come into Europe, they don't speak the language, they are very scared, they don't know where to go. They are not always aware about what treatment is available compared to the countries where they're coming from. And sometimes even the laws are not helping it. We still have in Europe a lot of countries that penalize the transmission or actually make it a crime not to disclose your status. So in these circumstances, you are not surprised that people often hide that they are living with HIV, sometimes feel ashamed, and it puts a lot of psychological burden on them. And all these reasons explain why, unfortunately, it's really hard to get to zero.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do you think there's a bigger role for the pharmaceutical industry to play when it comes to addressing these psychological burdens that can come with a HIV diagnosis?
Well, absolutely, but we have a huge role to play. And we spoke before about the medicines we've been able to develop, but what is very clear in the field of HIV is that the industry alone, or the policymakers alone, or the patient groups alone, or the physician alone can't succeed. It's actually a chain of solidarity, and we all have to pull on the same rope towards the same goal. And I think we have done a lot. I could say, okay, we've done our job. Yes, we suppress the virus. People, if we take the medicine, will be fine. But what we have seen, certainly at ViiV, is that when we really actively listen to patients and patients' associations, there is still a lot of unmet needs for the reasons I expressed. And people have told us they would love, now that they're going to grow very old and live almost a normal life, to actually not have this feeling they have to take so many drugs all their lives. Yes. So that's why we have developed a new 2 drug regimens, while for many, many years the 3 drug regimens were the standard of care. We also have invested in developing long-acting regimens, because what we see from patients who are taking long-acting regimens is that they tell us, the feedback we get, that they feel liberated. They really feel that they are again living a normal life. And a big layer of stigma that they had on their shoulders just evaporates. And so it's really encouraging. We have more to do, actually augmenting the space between the moment people have to take their medicines, and hopefully one day to get to a cure, which is what all the patients tell us is the hidden dream, or the dreams they're claiming out loud. The other area where we are really making great progress is PrEP. And you mentioned that a bit earlier. Of course, there's a challenge to get people to use PrEP, because they don't always know they're at risk. Some communities absolutely know they are, but some others don't know. But even if we manage to do that, we need to have very effective PrEP, because you don't have one chance to get it wrong. It has to be super effective for people to feel really protected. And now there is daily pill that exists. We are in a number of countries. We have launched also long-acting injectable for PrEP. We think it's going to have a massive impact in places like Africa and low middle-income countries, where it's very, very hard for people to get access to care, where the stigma is sometimes even worse than what we are experiencing in Europe. But there's a lot of work to do to develop the right medicine, but also to give access to the people who really will need it.
Definitely. I mean, it's really commendable to see, and I think those long-acting injectables will hopefully help a lot with patient adherence as well when it comes to not having to take that daily pill and actually having, is it administered by a practitioner as well?
It is administered by a practitioner. We can see a future which could become self-administered as well. So I would say the technology now is within reach.
It's interesting as well. I was researching before this interview. I read that PrEP was only approved for use on the NHS in 2020, which is quite shocking to me. And that comes, I think it was 8 years after the FDA approved it in the USA. Do you have any insights on why it took so long for us to catch up?
Well, of course, the health authorities have always to balance the cost effectiveness of a PrEP solution, because it's very hard to understand who should get access to it. And yes, it took a bit longer than what we would have wished, but now it's there. We know that in the UK we have about 80,000 people who are on PrEP. If we really want to stop the transmission and the acquisition of HIV in the UK, will we get there? I don't know. I hope, but I think the more we have easy to take solutions, the more we communicate, we raise awareness, we make people aware that HIV infections, like other infections, can be prevented. Vaccination is quite a popular intervention in UK, so there is no reason people would be against prevention. We just have to make sure they're aware, that they feel they could be at risk, and then they take the initiative to go and get it.
Definitely, yeah. I think I agree with you completely there, that touching on those community groups and making sure that the word is being spread around as much as
possible
Absolutely.
Is such a key driver in making that word actually reach the people.
And it's what you see in the UK. The majority of people currently on PrEP are typically MSM, but more vulnerable populations are really hard to reach, and that's where we have to make a massive amount of work to really get to them.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can see a big change as the years combine by 2030, if the UNAIDS map works. So we touched on, of course, the long-acting prophylactic as a sort of future of HIV prevention, but how do you envision the future of HIV care could evolve, both in terms of sort of
innovations like that and also day-to-day management?
Well, we have a lot of conversations and support with all the people involved, as I say, in the solidarity chain, to understand what really would make a difference. I think, first, even better medicines. As I said, I think we have achieved the goal of having effective and safe medicines. Now we have the opportunity to get one step further, is to have medicines that help the people live psychologically better, and that helps their mental health. We see that happening absolutely with long-acting injectable. So more investment in that field for both treatment and prevention. I think the way we simplify access to care is another aspect. I mean, you know, nowadays in Europe, a lot of people going to HIV clinic, they go to the back door. They don't dare to actually enter like other patients in the hospital. So it is still challenging for people to come to hospital to get their HIV care. So a solution that combines hospital care with outpatient care, I think, is a future to ensure that access is much broader. We also see checkpoints that are being developed in a number of important cities, where people are given a number of services linked to sexual health or sexually transmitted diseases. This is another way to normalize HIV. And finally, I think we need to reduce the stigma. We see that one of the key reasons why this disease is so difficult to control is much more stigmatized than everything else. Other diseases, there's stigma, as I said, but also stigma in the society. And the more we do to control that disease, the more we actually show that that disease is no longer a death sentence. You can live with it absolutely happily. The more we also help society to accept it. So effective medicines and stigma go hand in hand, but it's not sufficient. Awareness campaign, really showing solidarity and allyship with the people living with HIV across the different communities is essential. So if we combine these different aspects of care, great medicines, and addressing the stigma, I think we'll go a long way. And as I said, the ultimate goal is to find a cure.
Finding the goal of everyone. I do think it's such a shame that obviously when the AIDS epidemic first burst onto the scene in the US particularly, we saw so much misinformation going around.
Exactly.
And the huge amount of the stigma spreading still to this day still has its roots within the early 70s there. How long do you think it will take for that to sort of even out? Do you think it ever will?
Well, it's a constant effort, and we see that unfortunately many rights of the vulnerable populations are sometimes going backwards in some countries. So we need to keep fighting. We need to be on the front foot to first make sure that these communities are not stigmatized. They're sometimes already vulnerable, and adding the HIV burden to their situation is really not great. And we as a company, but also the partner we work with, we have a big role to play to mitigate that. Awareness, talking about it. I mean, many people don't know that if you suppress a virus, you don't transmit. So we have this undetectable, untransmissible, U equal U. That's not something, even in the healthcare professionals, that everybody feels comfortable about or even knows. And so, so much basic work to do in communication, reducing the gap between what the patient tell us is important to them and what the physicians are focusing on. So there is a gap there, and we can contribute to reducing that gap so that more and more it is a co-decision-making process between the people living with HIV, the healthcare professional, and sometimes the community.
Do you find it quite hard, or is it quite easy to find patient advocates for this space? Do you find that there's, I imagine, a sort of middle ground there where some people are very keen to talk about the diagnosis, whereas others may sort of shy away from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are becoming more and more vocal, and yes, it requires courage, obviously, but what is really nice to see is that we start having people really represent different kind of communities coming forward, explaining the specificity of what it means to live with HIV, if you're a sex worker, if you're an MSM, if you're a migrant, and therefore trying to clarify what are the policy changes or the communication needs that really would help to narrow that gap between how people feel and what they're receiving as care. But yes, we need to enable this dialogue to happen, supporting these associations. We play a big role as industry, but some governments are very, very active as well. And it's important they are, because they have to feel as well there's still more to do with HIV. We see in Europe, unfortunately, that the funding for HIV is going down. And certainly in Eastern Europe, it's really a problematic at the moment. So we can't let that happen, because we have made so much efforts. We are closer to solving the problem than the origin of the problem, but we still have the last few miles to walk together, and therefore we can't afford to let funding go. We need to be there. We need to support these communities. We need to make sure they have access to the best medicines to control the virus and to make them live psychologically better with HIV.
Amazing. So it's come up a few times during conversation about the end goal of ultimately curing HIV. What do you think it will take to actually end the HIV epidemic? And we've, again, touched on the role of governments here, but of course there are other key stakeholders that are working in there. How do you think people need to come together ultimately to see this goal through?
I think I would say the HIV community remains very united behind that ultimate goal. Activism has been a very key part of the HIV story. It's really kept all the actors on the toes, making sure nobody drops the ball or lose interest. And it's still very important that we don't take it for granted. We don't become complacent. So governments, they have to make sure that HIV remains a top policy agenda, that the funding is there to ensure the adequate treatment, the communication campaigns, the access to care. Patient associations, they have a big role to play, and as I said, from different perspectives, different communities. Industry, not just by providing medicines, but understanding of how these medicines will be used, in which context, and what are the medicines that really would be relevant for different kind of populations, so that we don't have the logic that one size fits all. We need to understand what everybody wants. Some people really like daily pills. Some people really prefer long-acting injectables. And then people who communicate, raise awareness, influencers, more and more. I think that's important that they also join the party to normalize HIV in the population.
Definitely agree with you. I think especially with the younger generations, I think influencers, digital opinion leaders, whatever we want to call
Absolutely. Peer-to-peer is the most effective way of communication.
Exactly. Yeah, and that sort of community-generated insights as well that isn't necessarily coming from an organisation or the government. And if you see that coming from one of your peers, as you say, I think that's much more... You can be much more understandable of, I think this person really has what's best for me in mind, whereas for other people that maybe don't trust the pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely. We need to be humble about that. I mean, it's about supporting people who will be actually talking to their peers and influencing the community, and making sure not to go talk about products, just make them aware of the conditions, how they can access to care, that they have a right to engage in this co-decision making with their physicians. And that's where I think we still have progress to make.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully we do see that progress in the years to come.
I'm sure we will.
It's been amazing chatting with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I think that was a really important conversation. I'm so glad we were able to host it on our channel. I really enjoyed listening to it. Jade, did you have any particular highlights you'd pick out?
Oh, there's a whole lot to choose from, and I think apart from JB being generally lovely to talk to, I really enjoyed hearing all the information he had to share about HIV in Europe specifically. Obviously, that's a specific area. It was a real shame to hear that I think he said 1 in 4 people haven't told their family members that they're living with the virus. And yeah, fear of that stigma is still really prevalent despite all of the work that's gone into improving perceptions when it does come to people living with HIV. It's a lifelong condition, and it's such a shame that some people don't feel comfortable to tell their families about it.
Yeah, definitely some stark statistics. And I think it was really compounded by what JB was saying there about the face of the epidemic changing. The burden of HIV among migrant populations was something that came up, and I mean, it just feels like another concern for a group of people who are already so vulnerable. So yeah, I think that was a really important point that he raised there as well.
Definitely. Well, hopefully, as I said, hopefully we'll see the UNAIDS roadmap to ending the HIV epidemic by 2030 provoke some real change over the next few years. But for now, that does bring us to the end of today's episode. Thanks again to JB for taking the time to chat with me, and thank you guys for listening.
It does indeed. Thank you so much for tuning in. As Jade said, it's been a great episode, and we'll see you next week.